What makes a king truly unforgettable? Some rulers etch their names into history with bloody conquests, dazzling achievements, or ruthless tyranny. But then, there are the others. The monarchs who reigned quietly, almost invisibly, so unremarkable that their names barely echo beyond the dusty pages of history books. They didn't lead legendary armies. They didn't inspire revolutions. Didn't even seem to want the job. Their weakness allowed empires to crumble. Their silence gave louder voices the power to shape nations. Or one who's so uninterested in ruling that his advisors simply take over the kingdom. Or worse, a king so indecisive that his hesitation sparks chaos across an entire country. And their dull, passive reigns often hid shocking personal struggles, fear, incompetence, even secret scandals that were swept under the royal carpet. But don't be fooled behind their dull reputations lie tales of collapse, betrayal, and quiet disasters that shaped the world more than their subjects ever realized. And yet these so-called boring kings may be more fascinating than you think, because sometimes their inaction changed the course of history just as much as any great hero or villain. Take a moment to imagine a king who's so timid he refuses to lead his armies. In this story, we're diving into the most boring kings in history, not the tales of great warriors or brilliant strategists, the ones who ruled in the dullest way possible and paid the price for it. And by the end, you'll see how sometimes the most forgettable rulers leave behind the most unforgettable consequences. So, let's step into a different kind of royal drama. Thellard the Unready. The king who paid to be left alone. Picture a king who sits on a throne that feels like a prison. Around him, the air is thick with fear and distrust. Courtiers whisper in dark corners, their loyalties unclear. The killing was swift and treacherous. Some said Edward was offered a cup of wine and then stabbed. Before he even dismounted his horse, it was spiritual. They believed God's favor rested on a rightful ruler, and the murder of Edward stained Leopold's reign before it even began. Whispers spread through monasteries and marketplaces that divine punishment would follow. It was said that the boy king was cursed, and in the years to come, many would look back and say those whispers were right. A handful of ships would appear, torching a coastal village or a monastery, slaughtering anyone who resisted, and then disappearing. He could have fortified the coasts and led his armies into battle like his predecessors had. Thellard gathered immense sums of silver from his people, taxing already struggling farmers and merchants, and handed it over to the invaders with a simple bargain: take the money and leave England alone. In a desperate attempt to reassert his authority, the Thellard ordered what became known as the St. Brice's Day Massacre. On a single November day, Danish settlers living peacefully in England were slaughtered. No longer were these simple raids for loot, they were campaigns for domination. Elfrid's government, already brittle, collapsed under the pressure. Unable to rally an effective defense, the king abandoned his throne altogether. He shows us that sometimes the quietest kings cause the loudest disasters. He fled across the Channel to Normandy, leaving his kingdom in chaos. Men, women, children, it didn't matter. The killings were meant as a warning, a show of strength. But instead, they ignited a firestorm. At first glance, it might have seemed practical. Why risk war when peace could be purchased? But the Vikings were no fools. Sweyn was no mere raider. He was a hardened conqueror, a man with ambitions far beyond plunder. When news of the massacre reached him, it wasn't fear that filled his heart. And yet fate gave to Thellard one last chance. Sweyn died suddenly in 1014, and the English nobles, desperate for any semblance of continuity, invited Thellard back. But by then, he was a broken man. He returned not as a savior, but as a ghost of a king. The Viking threat remained. His authority was hollow. His health failed, and in 1016 he died, leaving the crown to his son Edmund Ironside, who would soon face yet another Viking, Canute the Great. It was fury, and he vowed vengeance on the unready king who dared to strike at his people. It was something far more forgettable. A king who lacked the will to act, who preferred delay over decision, and whose inaction brought his kingdom to ruin. He ruled for nearly 40 years, yet history remembers only his failures. He was boring, yes, in the sense that he never won great battles or made bold moves. But his dullness, his hesitation, his fear of action, those qualities shaped the fate of England more than any grand gesture could have. They quickly realized that the English king was willing to pay almost anything to avoid a fight. And like predators who smell blood in the water, they came back again and again, demanding more each time. But the Thellard wasn't a fighter. He wasn't even a strategist. He was a man paralyzed by fear and indecision, haunted by the blood on which his throne rested. And so, instead of fighting the Vikings, he tried something else. He tried to buy them off. But as they realized how hesitant Thellard was, the attacks grew larger, bolder, more coordinated. Entire fleets of longships arrived, carrying warriors hungry for silver and land. They struck not just the coasts, but deep into the heart of the kingdom, burning churches, taking slaves and laughing at the king's weakness. And who stood to gain from the boy king's death? Many pointed fingers at Lelred's ambitious mother, Queen Gelthrith, who wanted her own son to rule. Whether Thellard knew of the plot or not, it didn't matter. A fleet of longships would arrive, ravage the countryside, accept Ethelred's payment, sail away, and then return the next year roar, sometimes the next month to do it all over again. Ash! Every payment made Thellard weaker. Every bag of silver emptied the treasury and humiliated the crown. The people grew bitter, seeing their hard-earned wealth handed to the very men who terrorized them. The nobles grumbled. Church began to question whether their king was truly chosen by God. And still, Thellard hesitated. When Edward was buried in haste, the throne passed to the young boy, and the shadow of fratricide hung over him like a curse. Messengers bring nothing but bad news from the countryside-burned villages. Odds terrified peasants, ships full of raiders prowling the coasts. And the man who wears the crown is young, uncertain, haunted by a past drenched in blood. This is Thellard, the boy who would grow into one of England's most notorious failures. His story begins with murder. In 978 AD, his half-brother, Edward, called the Martyr by later generations, was cut down at the gates of Corfe Castle. To the people of England, a king's legitimacy wasn't just political, because soon after, the storm came. For generations, England had suffered under the terror of Viking raids. These weren't random bandits, but disciplined warriors who came in sleek, fast ships, struck with shocking brutality, and vanished before an army could catch them.
Alfred.
The great Alfred's distant ancestor had fought them to a standstill decades earlier, building fortresses and crafting treaties that kept a fragile peace. But by the late 10th century, the Viking threat had evolved. They weren't just raiding for treasure, they were coming to conquer, and they saw England as ripe for the taking. The raids began modestly at first, almost like tests. The Thellard had choices. He could have rallied the great earls and thanes of his realm. It was called the Dane-Keld, literally, the Dane payment. This cycle of bribery and betrayal became a sick joke. And then, in the year 1002, he made a decision so catastrophic, it sealed his reputation forever. Among those killed was, reportedly, the sister of Sweyn Forkbeard, the King of Denmark. The response was swift and merciless. Sweyn launched a full-scale invasion. His fleets burned towns along the Thames. Armies marched inland, laying waste to entire shires. For a time, England had no king. Sweyn Forkbeard was declared ruler. It seemed the age of the Anglo-Saxon kings was over, and so Thellard became a cautionary tale. He wasn't a tyrant. He wasn't a hero. Perhaps that's the most haunting thing about Thellard, the unready. Sigebert III, the king who let everyone else rule. There are kings who fail because they make the wrong choices. Then there are kings who fail because they make no choices at all. Sigebert III of Austrasia was one of those. He was barely a child when the weight of the Merovingian crown was placed on his head. In 633 AD, he was too young to understand the political games being played around him. And by the time he came of age, the habit of letting others rule in his name had become permanent. He simply never stepped into the role he was born to hold. In those days, the Merovingian dynasty descendants of the legendary King Clovis was already a fading shadow of its former glory. Power had slipped away from the throne and into the hands of ambitious nobles and, most notably, the so-called mayors of the palace, the royal stewards, who increasingly acted as the real rulers. There were no grand wars to drain the kingdom's resources, no harsh royal decrees to upset the social order, but peace came at a cost. Local nobles grew bolder, imposing their own taxes and justice. The bonds that held the kingdom together weakened. He arranged for the boy to be tonsured, that is, given a monk's haircut and sent to a monastery, effectively disqualifying him from becoming king. The plan failed in the end, but the damage was done. The illusion that the Merovingian kings still held real authority was shattered. From then on, they were mocked as ROI lazy kings, do-nothing kings. But he was the kind of king who simply existed while history moved on without him. Boring? Absolutely. But his passivity shows how even a king who does nothing can reshape the world, not through action, but through absence. In his place, Grimoald tried to install his own son as ruler. Think about that for a moment. The advisor of the king felt bold enough to bypass the royal bloodline altogether. The Pepinid family, the line that produced the ambitious mayors of the palace, would eventually rise to replace the Merovingians altogether. From them came Pepin the Short, and from Pepin came Charlemagne, one of the greatest rulers of the medieval world. In a strange twist of fate, Sigebert's weakness allowed new power to grow in the shadows, changing the course of European history. That's how irrelevant the Merovingian throne had become. Sigebert grew up in a world where the title of king still carried a sacred aura, but the actual responsibilities of governance were quietly being stripped away. Instead of commanding armies, he attended religious ceremonies. Instead of drafting laws or forging alliances, he retreated into quiet piety. Sigebert was, by all accounts, deeply devout. It was something much subtler, the slow erosion of royal authority. He died relatively young, in his mid-20s, remembered more for his charitable works than for any act of statecraft. To some, he was a saintly figure, a ruler who cared more for his soul than for power. But to historians, he became a symbol of decline, a man who wore the crown but surrendered the substance of kingship to others. With every year that passed, the Merovingian kings became less like rulers and more like ceremonial figureheads. Sigebert was still respected as the anointed monarch, but everyone knew he wasn't really in charge. He spent long hours in prayer, supporting monasteries and churches, giving away gifts to the clergy. The people saw him as gentle, humble, even saintly. But in a world where kingdoms were carved up by sword and cunning, gentleness was just another word for weakness. The mayor of the palace during Sigebert's reign, a man named Grimoald, was the opposite of his king. Grimoald was shrewd, calculating, and hungry for power. While Sigebert busied himself with spiritual matters, Grimoald quietly consolidated control. He managed the finances, commanded the army, negotiated treaties. Nobles who once would have bowed before the king now came to the mayor for favors and decisions. And Sigebert allowed it. This wasn't the dramatic downfall of a tyrant or the fiery end of a warrior king. For ordinary people, this created a strange duality. On one hand, life under Sigebert was peaceful, and then came the fateful decision that would expose just how powerless the Merovingian kings had become. When Sigebert's own son was still a child, Grimoald, the mayor of the palace, saw an opportunity. It was a shocking move, and it sparked outrage among the old nobility. Sigebert himself didn't live to see the dynasty's ultimate collapse. And yet, in his quiet failure, Sigebert unintentionally paved the way for something much greater. He wasn't hated, wasn't even truly forgotten. Louis V, the last forgettable Carolingian. Now we cross into West Francia in the late 10th century, a time when the once mighty Carolingian Empire was crumbling. And standing on that collapsing stage was Louis V, a young king destined to be remembered for almost nothing at all. Louis V came to the throne in 986 AD, inheriting what was left of the realm that Charlemagne had built. But, by Louis's time, the empire had splintered into fragments. Local lords ruled their territories like mini-kings. They tried to steer the kingdom's fragile politics, but even their influence couldn't halt the Carolingian decline. Louis himself seemed almost indifferent to the fact that his dynasty was dying. The royal court in Leon was weak, its influence limited, its coffers nearly empty. He didn't lose his kingdom in a great battle. And from them came the powerful French monarchy that would dominate Europe for centuries. In a strange way, Louis's very failure became the bridge to something greater. He didn't inspire legends, good or bad. He was just there for a brief moment, a powerless figure caught in the dying breaths of his dynasty. His reign was like a candle flickering before it goes out, barely noticed before it disappears. In 987, barely a year into his reign, Louis went out on yet another hunting trip. Somewhere in the forest, his horse stumbled, or bolted a count's very end. Louis was thrown violently to the ground. The fall broke his neck. Just like that, the last direct male heir of the Carolingian dynasty in West Francia was dead. No grand betrayal, no heroic last stand, just a hunting accident. The crown itself had lost much of its prestige, and Louis, barely in his 20s, seemed entirely unsuited to reversing that decline. By all accounts, Louis was more interested in hunting and leisure than in politics. He loved the chase, the feast, the excitement of the hunt. While the nobles squabbled for power and the kingdom's borders were threatened, Louis spent his days riding through forests. Hawk on his wrist, far removed from the burdens of statecraft, he issued few decrees, made no great reforms, and didn't even attempt to assert his authority over the fractious nobility. They simply elected a new king, Hugh Capet, the powerful duke of the Franks' founding, the Capetian dynasty that would rule France for centuries. Louis's death wasn't even a tragedy. It was an afterthought, a quiet turning of the page in history. In truth, Louis wasn't really in control. The real power behind the throne was his mother, Queen Emma, Archbishop Adalbero of Reims. And then came the absurdly anticlimactic end. With Louis gone, and no legitimate Carolingian heir left, the nobles didn't mourn for long. And that's what makes Louis V such a boring king. Yet even his insignificance shaped the future. Because he failed to secure the Carolingian line, the Capetians rose. A king who lived a year, ruled nothing, accomplished nothing, and died in the woods, yet even that dull ending changed the course of a nation. Robert III of Scotland, the king who feared his own shadow. Robert III of Scotland is the kind of king who might have passed through history almost unnoticed, if not for how pathetically tragic his life became. Born John Stuart in 1337, he was the son of Robert II, the first monarch of the Stuart dynasty. But from the start, there was an uncomfortable truth about him. He simply wasn't made for the brutal, cutthroat world of medieval Scottish politics. Before he even became king, misfortune struck. As a young man, he suffered a severe injury when a horse kicked him, leaving him permanently lame and in fragile health. This single accident shaped his entire reign. Robert's eldest son, David, Duke of Rothesay, was supposed to inherit the throne. But Rothesay was brash, reckless, and dangerously naive. But everyone knew Albany had engineered it, removing the heir to solidify his own grip on power. And what did Robert III do when he heard his son had been murdered? Isolated, humiliated, and powerless, Robert III withdrew to Rothesay Castle on the Isle of Bute. There, broken and hopeless, he let himself waste away. As he lay dying, he supposedly asked to be buried in the humble robes of a friar, believing he was unworthy of a king's burial. He died that same year, leaving a kingdom effectively ruled by Albany, and a son still held hostage in England. He was too frail, too timid, too afraid to confront Albany. He didn't unite his people or expand his realm. Instead, he is remembered for letting his family be destroyed around him, and for allowing a ruthless uncle to tear apart the kingdom. He issued no justice. He made no move to protect his remaining child, James, who now became the new heir. He angered the Scottish nobles by interfering in their privileges. And in 1402, he was arrested under suspicious circumstances. By who else? For on the journey, James was captured by English pirates and delivered to King Henry IV of England, who held him prisoner. Robert was devastated, but again, he lacked the strength to act. He didn't raise an army to free his son. He didn't retaliate against England. He simply sank deeper into despair. His ambitious uncle Albany. Rothesay was imprisoned at Falkland Palace, where he soon died, reportedly from starvation. In an age when kings were expected to ride at the head of armies, charging into battle as living symbols of strength, Robert limped both physically and politically. When he inherited the throne in 1390, he seemed unsure of himself from the very beginning. In a world of sharks, Robert was a wounded fishy prey for the predators around him. His reign was boring in its passivity, but that very passivity led Scotland into deeper chaos, setting the stage for decades of turmoil. Even the name he chose as King Robert, instead of John, was a sign of his insecurity. He didn't even try to enforce his authority over Scotland's notoriously unruly nobles, many of whom were far more ambitious than he ever was. Instead, he let others rule for him. At first, his younger brother, the Duke of Albany, stepped into that power vacuum. Albany was everything Robert wasn't: ruthless, cunning, and willing to do whatever it took to keep control. Over time, Albany became the real ruler of Scotland, while Robert faded into the background. The last Scottish king, John Balliol, had been humiliated and deposed by the English. And Robert didn't want that cursed name associated with his reign. But no change of name could hide his weaknesses. Robert III avoided conflict at all costs. He wasn't decisive. He wasn't assertive. But even a passive king can be forced into crisis. The official story claimed it was an accident or natural illness. Fearing the same fate for young James, Robert sent the boy away to France for safety. By 1406, his health was failing completely. Robert III's reign was marked by almost nothing. No major battles, no bold reforms, no grand gestures. And yet his failure tells a bigger story, shows what happens when a king refuses to act. Wenceslas, the fourth of Bohemia, the drunkard who watched his kingdom burn. If Robert III was a king paralyzed by fear, Wenceslas IV of Bohemia was undone by indulgence. Born in 1361, he was the son of the great Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV, towering figure who had expanded and stabilized the empire. Wenceslas inherited not only Bohemia, but also the prestigious title of King of the Romans. Should have made him one of the most powerful men in Europe. But Wenceslas was not his father. Where Charles had been disciplined and politically astute, Wenceslas was distracted. He loved drinking. He loved hunting. He loved the pleasures of court life far more than the tedious work of ruling. His nickname in his own time, Wenzel der Fall, Wenceslas the Idle. At first, it might have seemed harmless. After all, he wasn't cruel or particularly oppressive. But as he ignored the affairs of state, cracks began to form. In Bohemia, tensions simmered between the German-speaking elite and the native Czech population. In the Holy Roman Empire, the powerful prince-electors grew restless without an active emperor to mediate disputes. Meanwhile, Wenceslas spent his days on endless hunts, returning to Prague drunk and disheveled, leaving petitions unanswered and appointments neglected. His advisors begged him to take matters seriously, but he dismissed their concerns. His negligence had real consequences. When religious reformer Jan Hus began preaching in Bohemia, criticizing the corruption of the Catholic Church, unrest spread through Prague. Instead of addressing the growing tension, Wenceslas retreated further into his personal pleasures. His inaction allowed the situation to spiral, eventually leading to the Hussite Wars, one of the most destructive conflicts in Central Europe. Even his fellow German princes lost patience. In 1400, they formally deposed Wenceslas as king of the Romans, citing his negligence and incapacity. They elected Rupert of the Palatinate, in his place humiliating Wenceslas on the European stage. Back in Bohemia, his own nobles began to plot. He imprisoned him multiple times, demanding reforms, but he always managed to negotiate his release without actually changing anything. It became a vicious cycle. Arrest, release, broken promises, more chaos. Wenceslas clung to the Bohemian throne until his death in 1419. But by then, his kingdom was a powder keg ready to explode. Within months of his passing, the Hussite Wars erupted, plunging Bohemia into decades of religious violence. Wenceslas is remembered as a boring king, not because nothing happened during his reign, but because he didn't make anything happen. Events simply rolled over him while he drowned himself in drink. His failure to act created a vacuum that others, nobles, priests, rebels, filled with their own agendas. He was a king who could have changed the course of history, but chose the comfort of the bottle instead. And in doing so, he let his kingdom burn. Charles II of Spain, the bewitched king who couldn't rule himself. Few monarchs have been as pitied or ridiculed as Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs. He was born in 1661 into a family that had ruled vast empires stretching from Europe to the Americas. A dynasty once so powerful it was said the sun never set on their lands. But by the time Charles entered the world, centuries of inbreeding had taken their toll. He was not just a weak king, he was a man barely capable of living a normal life. From birth, it was clear something was wrong. Charles was sickly, frail, and developmentally delayed. His tongue was so oversized that he struggled to speak clearly or even chew food properly. He didn't walk until he was 4, didn't learn to read until he was 10, and was plagued by constant illness. Rumors spread through the Spanish court that he was bewitched, cursed by dark magic, which earned him the nickname El Hechizado, the Bewitched. But it wasn't witchcraft, it was genetics. For generations, the Habsburgs had married within their own family to keep their royal bloodline pure. By Charles's time, the inbreeding coefficient was so high that he was the product of a dangerously narrow gene pool. His jaw, the infamous Habsburg jaw, was so deformed that he could barely close his mouth. He was infertile, mentally fragile, and physically incapable of the demands of kingship. Yet he was king. The moment he inherited the throne in 1665, Spain was already in decline. The empire was overextended, its economy was faltering, its once invincible army was losing wars to France and other rising powers. Charles II was supposed to reverse this decline, but how could he? He could barely make decisions for himself, let alone for an empire. Real power fell into the hands of his regents. First his mother Mariana of Austria, and later a series of scheming nobles and priests who vied for influence over the helpless monarch. The Spanish court became a nest of intrigue, with factions manipulating Charles like a puppet. Each side whispered in his ear that the other was plotting against him, deepening his paranoia. Charles himself believed he was cursed. He ordered exorcisms. He demanded holy relics to protect him from evil spirits. At one point, a priest convinced him that his infertility was the result of witchcraft. He even had the corpse of his great-grandmother exhumed and publicly displayed, hoping it would somehow break the spell. Meanwhile, Spain crumbled. Wars drained the treasury. Corruption ran rampant. Provinces rebelled. The once mighty Habsburg Empire that had ruled half of Europe became a hollow shell. Foreign ambassadors visiting Madrid described the king as a tragic spectacle. A man-child incapable of holding a coherent conversation, staring blankly while others made decisions in his name. Desperate to secure an heir, Charles was married twice, but both marriages were childless. His first wife, Marie Louise of, was reportedly horrified by his appearance and ill health. She died young, exhausted by the pressures of life at the Spanish court. His second wife, Mariana of Neuburg, fared no better. She also failed to produce an heir, further fueling the king's despair. By the late 1690s, it was obvious Charles would die without children. And with his impending death came the terrifying question: who would inherit the vast but decaying Spanish Empire? Europe held its breath. France and Austria both had claims to the throne through various Habsburg marriages. The succession crisis threatened to plunge the continent into war. In his final years, Charles became almost a living ghost. His health deteriorated so badly that he could barely move. Courtiers described him as pale, emaciated, and barely able to eat without assistance. He suffered seizures, hallucinations, and endless pain. Yet even in this state, factions around him continued to fight for his signature on wills and treaties. Finally, in 1700, at just 38 years old, Charles II died. His death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a massive conflict that reshaped the balance of power in Europe. Charles II was a king who couldn't rule himself, let alone his empire. He was more a victim of his dynasty than a monarch, the final, pitiful result of centuries of Habsburg inbreeding and mismanagement. He accomplished nothing, made no great decisions, fought no wars personally, and left no heir. And yet his sheer inability to govern changed the map of Europe forever. He's remembered as boring because he never had the strength or will to do anything grand or terrible. He simply existed while his empire decayed around him. But sometimes, the absence of action is as catastrophic as any mistake. Henry VI of England, the king who forgot to be king. Henry VI's reign reads like a prolonged nervous breakdown stretched across decades. If Charles II of Spain was physically incapable of ruling, Henry VI of England was emotionally and mentally unfit. But no one dared admit it until the kingdom had nearly torn itself to pieces. Born in 1421, Henry became king as a baby after the sudden death of his famous father. Henry V, the hero of Agincourt, the warrior king who'd brought France to its knees. The English people had high hopes for the infant heir, but it quickly became apparent that Henry was not like his father. Where Henry V had been strong, aggressive, and cunning, Henry VI was soft-spoken, passive, and deeply pious. He preferred prayer to politics, reflection to rulership, and harmony to war. At first, this didn't seem like a disaster. England was governed by capable regents during Henry's childhood, and the country even held on to its hard-won French territories. But as Henry grew older and began to rule in his own right, things fell apart, refused to discipline corrupt officials. He trusted the wrong advisors. He'd failed to protect the crown's interests in France, and slowly, piece by piece, the English lost everything they'd gained. By 1453, the situation was critical. England's hold on France had collapsed. At home, tensions between the great noble houses had reached boiling point. And then came the moment that defined Henry's entire reign. He suffered a complete mental breakdown. For over a year, he couldn't speak, couldn't move, and barely recognized his own child. He became a ghost on the throne. During this period, the Duke of York, Richard Plantagenet, stepped in as Lord Protector. And just like that, the seeds of the Wars of the Roses were sown. Henry's incapacity sparked a dynastic civil war that would rage for decades, plunge England into chaos, and see kings deposed and murdered in cold blood. But even after his recovery, Henry refused to take control. He let others lead. His Queen Margaret of Anjou took the reins and became a fierce political force in her own right. But her involvement only deepened the rivalries at court. Battles broke out, castles were sieged, families were destroyed. And through it all, Henry stood by helplessly, offering prayers and weeping silently as his kingdom burned. In 1461, Henry was deposed by Edward IV of the House of York. He was later captured, imprisoned, and briefly restored during a political reversal, only to be captured again. By 1471, the once king was locked in the Tower of London, mentally broken and politically irrelevant. That same year, after the Battle of Tewkesbury sealed the Yorkist victory, Henry was quietly murdered, almost certainly on the orders of Edward IV. No trial, no ceremony, it's just a dagger in the dark. Henry VI's reign was a catastrophe of indecision, weakness, and spiritual detachment. He wanted to be a good man, a peaceful king, a ruler of moral virtue. But history has no mercy for kings who can't rule. His inaction dragged England through civil war, and his failures cost thousands their lives. In trying to be a saint, he forgot how to be a sovereign. A boring king, perhaps. But only in the sense that he didn't command armies or deliver speeches. His reign was anything but uneventful. It was a slow-motion implosion of the medieval English state. And it all began with a man who simply wasn't built to wear a crown. Louis XVI of France, the king who didn't see the guillotine coming. Louis XVI was not born to be a revolutionary villain. He wasn't a tyrant in the traditional sense, nor was he a cruel despot. In fact, by most accounts, he was a kind, gentle man, deeply devoted to his family, interested in science, and fond of quiet hobbies like locksmithing. But in one of history's most merciless ironies, Louis XVI's greatest flaw was his inability to grasp the world collapsing around him. He wasn't evil. He was simply oblivious. And in revolutionary France, oblivion was a death sentence. Born in 1754, Louis Auguste became the dauphined heir to the French, thrown after his father died prematurely. In 1774, at the age of 20, he became king following the death of his grandfather, Louis XV. France at that time was already staggering under the weight of debt, corruption, and decades of mismanagement. The people were restless, hungry, and increasingly aware that the lavish lifestyles of the aristocracy were funded by their suffering. Louis didn't create these problems, but he inherited them, and he was far too indecisive to fix them. From the start, Louis XVI was ill-suited for the brutal demands of ruling an absolute monarchy on the brink of collapse. He was shy, awkward, and easily influenced by those around him. He had some good intentions. He tried to implement financial reforms. He reduced the extravagant spending of the court in small ways, but he lacked the political will to confront the entrenched privileges of the nobility. Every time he faced resistance, he wavered, backtracked, or simply did nothing. His marriage to Marie Antoinette, the Austrian Archduchess, didn't help his public image. The French people saw her as an outsider, a frivolous foreign queen who spent lavishly while they starved. Though many of the infamous rumors about her excesses, like the famous "let them eat cake" line, were exaggerated or false, they fed into the growing rage against the monarchy. Louis, instead of defending her or reshaping the public narrative, stayed silent, hoping the storm would pass. But the storm didn't pass. It grew. By the late 1780s, France was drowning in debt, much of it incurred by aiding the American Revolution. 06 AD shortages turned desperation into fury. When Louis finally called the Estates General in 1789, a National Assembly that hadn't met in over 170 years, he unleashed forces he could no longer control. The Third Estate, representing the common people, broke away and declared itself the National Assembly, vowing to draft a new constitution. In response, Louis hesitated. Should he crush them with force? Should he embrace reform? He did neither. Instead, he waffled, signing some decrees, opposing others, sending mixed signals to both revolutionaries and loyalists. Then came July 14, 1789, the storming of the Bastille. The French Revolution had begun. Even as the monarchy crumbled around him, Louis still didn't fully grasp the danger. When angry crowds marched on Versailles in October 1789, forcing the royal family to move to Paris under the watch of revolutionary guards, Louis convinced himself it was just a temporary phase. He believed that if he played along, the people's anger would subside. But deep down, he never accepted the revolution. In 1791, in a disastrous move, Louis and his family attempted to flee France. Disguised and traveling by night, they made it as far as the town of Varennes before being recognized and captured. That single moment destroyed what little trust remained between the king and his people. The revolutionaries saw it as proof that Louis was plotting against them. After that, Louis XVI was no longer seen as a constitutional monarch trying to work with the people. He was seen as a traitor. As the revolution radicalized, power shifted from moderate reformers to the more extreme factions. By 1792, the monarchy was abolished altogether. Louis was arrested, stripped of his titles, and placed on trial as Louis Capet, a mere citizen accused of betraying the nation. Throughout the trial, Louis maintained a calm dignity. He defended his actions as those of a man trying to protect his people, not harm them. But the revolutionaries had already decided his fate. In January 1793, the king was sentenced to death. On the morning of January 21st, 1793, Louis XVI was led to the guillotine in the Place de la. Witnesses said he faced his execution bravely. He tried to speak to the crowd, declaring his innocence and forgiving his enemies, but the drum roll drowned his words. Moments later, the blade fell, and with it ended centuries of Bourbon rule. Louis XVI was a boring king in the sense that he wasn't a monster, nor was he a visionary. He was a man who wanted peace, who preferred tinkering with locks and studying maps to ruling an empire on the edge of chaos. But history doesn't forgive kings who fail to act. His indecision turned discontent into revolution, and his inability to see the world changing sealed his fate. He didn't die because he was hated as a person. He died because he represented a system that could no longer survive, and because he never truly understood that until it was too late. Ferdinand VII of Spain, the king who betrayed his own people. If Louis XVI was a tragic fool swept away by events he didn't understand, Ferdinand VII of Spain was something arguably worse, a man who did understand power, but chose to wield it in the most cowardly, self-serving way possible. Ferdinand came to prominence during one of Spain's darkest moments. In 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte forced the abdication of Ferdinand's father, Charles IV, and placed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne. The Spanish people rose up in rebellion, beginning a brutal guerrilla war against the French occupation. During this time, Ferdinand was seen as a symbol of national resistance, a rightful king who would one day return to liberate his people. But when Napoleon finally fell, and Ferdinand was restored to the throne in 1813, the Spanish people discovered the bitter truth. He was no liberator. He was a cowardly opportunist. During the war, Spain's revolutionary Cortes had drafted the Constitution of 1812. One of the most progressive charters in Europe at the time. It limited royal power, expanded civil liberties, and created the framework for a modern constitutional monarchy. Spaniards believed that when Ferdinand returned, he would embrace this new era of reform. Instead, Ferdinand did the opposite. Within days of regaining the crown, he tore up the constitution, abolished the Cortes, and reinstated absolute monarchy. He persecuted liberals, imprisoned reformers, and unleashed a wave of repression so severe it became known as the White Terror. Spain had suffered years of war to free itself from Napoleon, only to fall back into the hands of a reactionary king who learned nothing from the past. And it didn't stop there. Ferdinand's weakness and short-sightedness cost Spain its overseas empire. While he cracked down on dissent at home, the colonies in Latin America, Mexico, Colombia, Argentina rose in revolt. Ferdinand sent armies to suppress them, but his forces were stretched too thin, and one by one, Spain's American territories won their independence. Under his watch, Spain lost the vast majority of its empire, even when he was forced to accept a constitutional monarchy during the liberal triennium. Ferdinand schemed behind the scenes, plotting with foreign monarchs to restore his absolute power. When French troops invaded Spain to put him back on the throne, he thanked them by unleashing yet another round of purges and executions against those who had supported constitutional government. By the time Ferdinand VII died in 1833, Spain was a broken, backward state. Torn between reactionaries and liberals, with a succession crisis brewing that would plunge the country into civil war, he left no legacy of strength, no vision, no progression, a trail of betrayal and decline. Ferdinand was boring in the sense that he never displayed the grand charisma of a Napoleon or the tragic dignity of a Louis XVI. He was simply a petty, selfish man clinging to a crumbling throne. But in his mediocrity, he inflicted more damage on Spain than many of its enemies ever could. John of England, the king who lost everything. If you've ever heard the legend of Robin Hood, you already know the villainous caricature of King John, the greedy, cowardly ruler who oppressed his people while his noble brother Richard the Lionheart fought in the Crusades. But beyond the myth, the real King John of England was, in many ways, even worse. Wasn't just unpopular, he was catastrophically incompetent. Born in 1166, John was the youngest son of the great Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, which meant he was never expected to inherit much. In fact, his father nicknamed him John Lackland because he wasn't given the vast estates and titles his older brothers enjoyed. But through a mixture of luck, death, and treachery, John eventually found himself on the throne in 1199, after the death of his famous brother Richard I. And that's where the disaster began. John inherited one of the most powerful realms in Europe. England controlled not just the British Isles, but also huge swaths of territory in France, Normandy, Aquitaine. It was an empire stretching across the Channel. But John lacked every quality needed to hold it together. He was suspicious to the point of paranoia, quick to anger, and utterly incapable of inspiring loyalty. Where his father had been a master politician, and his brother a celebrated warrior, John was neither. He alienated his barons with heavy taxes and arbitrary justice. He made enemies of the church by quarreling with the Pope, and he lost the support of the common people through sheer greed. But his greatest failure was in war. In 1204, through a mix of poor strategy and betrayal, John lost Normandy to the French king, Philip II. This wasn't just a minor setback. It was the collapse of centuries of Plantagenet dominance in France. The shame of that defeat haunted John for the rest of his reign. Desperate to reclaim his lost lands, he squeezed England for money, levying harsh taxes and extorting the nobility. But even with all that, he couldn't win. His campaigns were poorly planned, his allies unreliable, and his reputation so toxic that even his own vassals refused to fight for him. And then came the breaking point. By 1215, England's barons had had enough. They rebelled, forcing John to the negotiating table. The result was the Magna Carta, one of the most famous documents in history. It limited the king's power, guaranteed certain rights to the nobility, and laid the groundwork for the concept of constitutional government. But make no mistake, the Magna Carta wasn't born out of John's wisdom or generosity. It was ripped from him because no one trusted him anymore. Of course, true to form, John had no intention of honoring it. The moment he could, he renounced the agreement, plunging England into civil war. But his final years were marked by desperation and decline. He wandered the country, trying to crush the rebellion, but his support dwindled. His health began to fail. In 1216, while fleeing from his enemies, John famously lost much of his royal treasure in the tidal mudflats of the Wash in eastern England, perfect metaphor for his reign. Later that year, he died of dysentery, leaving the throne to his 9-year-old son, Henry III. John was a king who inherited power he wasn't equipped to wield. He wasn't brave, he wasn't clever, and he wasn't beloved. Yet in his failure, he inadvertently set into motion one of the most important shifts in English history. The idea that a king's power could be limited. Magna Carta became a cornerstone for later democratic principles. But only because John was so spectacularly bad at being a monarch. Was he boring? Some ways, yes. He lacked the grand charisma of his brother Richard, or the towering menace of a conqueror like William the Bastard. He didn't lead epic crusades or build lasting monuments. He simply lost. Lost land, lost allies, lost his people's faith, lost everything. And sometimes a king who loses everything tells us more about power than one who gains it all. Philip III of France, the king who followed orders. In the long history of French monarchs, Philip III, known as Philip the Bold, sits almost like a shadow present, but hardly noticed. Born in 1245, Philip was the son of Louis IX, the revered St. Louis, one of France's most admired and pious kings. And that's the first problem with Philip's legacy. He lived in the shadow of a saint. When Louis IX went off on his disastrous final crusade in 1270, Philip accompanied him. It was during this campaign in Tunisia that Philip's defining trait became clear. He was obedient. Louis fell gravely ill, and Philip stayed by his side. When his father finally died of dysentery, Philip became king not through ambition or triumph, but through tragedy. At just 25 years old, Philip returned to France, not as a victorious crusader, but as a dutiful son, bringing home his father's body. And that sense of duty of simply following what others had set in motion defined his entire reign. Philip III ruled from 1270 to 1285, and in those 15 years, he made almost no mark on history. He continued the administrative reforms his father had begun, but introduced nothing truly new. He waged small, relatively insignificant campaigns, such as the annexation of Toulouse, but these were more the results of treaties arranged before his reign than his own initiatives. Even in his personal life, Philip seemed more like a passenger than a driver. His mother, Margaret of Provence, and later his closest advisors, heavily influenced his decisions. He rarely asserted himself in the way his successors would. In an age when kings were expected to embody strength, cunning, and charisma, Philip was mild-mannered, soft-spoken, and ordinary. The one major event of his reign was the Aragonese Crusade, and it wasn't even his idea. Pope Martin IV, furious at King Peter III of Aragon for taking Sicily, called for a crusade to punish him. Philip, being the obedient king he was, agreed. He marched his forces into Aragon in 1285, but the campaign was a complete disaster. Disease ravaged the French army. Morale collapsed. And Philip himself fell ill with dysentery during the retreat. He died on the way back to France, leaving the throne to his far more ambitious son, Philip IV. Philip III wasn't cruel, nor was he a fool. He simply existed. He maintained what was already there, followed the path laid out for him, and left almost nothing of his own. He didn't lose everything like King John, nor did he spark revolutions like Louis XVI. He was a placeholder between two far more significant rulers, Louis IX, the saint, and Philip IV, the iron-handed architect of France's rise to power. His reign was peaceful, yes. Stable, yes. But history rarely remembers those who only maintain. Philip III was a bridge from one era to another, a king who mattered mostly because of who came before and after him. Sometimes the dullest kings are the ones who cause the least trouble. But in their dullness, they vanish into the background of history, their names surviving only in dusty genealogies and obscure chronicles. Emperor Go-Momozono of Japan, the forgotten chrysanthemum. In the long line of Japan's imperial rulers, many emperors are remembered for their poetry, their patronage of art, or their political cunning during the turbulent shogunate eras. But Emperor Go-Momozono, who reigned from 1771 to 1779, is remembered for almost nothing at all. His reign was a brief flicker in history, quiet, uneventful, and overshadowed by the far more powerful Tokugawa shoguns, who actually governed Japan during the Edo period. Go-Momozono was born Prince Hidehito, the second son of Emperor Momozono. In 1771, he ascended the chrysanthemum throne after the abdication of his aunt, Empress Go-Sakura Machi. For centuries, real power had belonged to the shogunate in Edo, while the imperial court in Kyoto existed more as a symbol of tradition than a functioning government. As a result, Go-Momozono's reign was almost entirely devoid of political agency. He had no army, no control over the country's administration, and no influence on the major policies of the era. Instead, his daily life revolved around court rituals, poetry, religious ceremonies, and the careful preservation of the imperial lineage. That might sound peaceful, but it also meant that when crises struck, the emperor could do nothing but watch. And during Go-Momozono's short reign, Japan experienced one of the worst natural disasters of the century, the Great Tenmai Famine. Beginning in 1772, poor weather, crop failures, and a volcanic eruption at Mount Asama combined to devastate rice production. Starvation spread across the countryside. In some regions, desperate peasants resorted to eating tree bark and wild grasses. Tens of thousands died. And yet, from the imperial palace in Kyoto, Go-Momozono had no means to alleviate the suffering. Relief efforts were controlled entirely by the shogunate, and even those were woefully inadequate. The famine also triggered social unrest. Villagers rioted against corrupt officials and rice merchants who hoarded food. In Edo, mobs attacked warehouses and demanded lower prices. But through all of this, the emperor remained a distant figure, unable to intervene, unable to even publicly speak about the suffering. Go-Momozono's personal life was equally quiet. He was known to be gentle and somewhat scholarly, spending time on classical Chinese and Japanese literature. But he never married, and for most of his reign, he had no heirs, alarming problem for a dynasty that prided itself on an unbroken line stretching back centuries. As his health began to decline in 1779, the imperial court faced a looming succession crisis. In his final days, Go-Momozono adopted an heir from a cadet branch of the family Prince Morohito, who would later become Emperor Kaku. That decision secured the future of the imperial line, but it was the only major action of consequence in his entire reign. Go-Momozono died that same year at the age of just 21. His funeral was modest by imperial standards, and his name quickly faded from the memory of the people. He left behind no poetry that changed literature, no policies that reshaped the court, no monuments, no wars, no reforms, nothing but a thin chapter in the chronicles of the chrysanthemum throne. In a way, his reign reflects the quiet tragedy of the Japanese imperial system during the Edo period. The emperor was the theoretical head of the nation, descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu herself. Yet he was politically powerless, living in ceremonial isolation while real decisions were made elsewhere. Go-Momozono was not a bad ruler, nor was he an incompetent one. He was simply irrelevant. And sometimes, irrelevance is the dullest legacy of all. Emperor Taisho of Japan, the gentle shadow of a modernizing nation. If Go-Momozono was a forgotten emperor of a powerless court, Emperor Taisho was a forgotten emperor of a modernizing Japan, a monarch who reigned during a transformative era, but was too frail and reclusive to leave any mark on it. Born in 1879 as Yoshihito, he was the son of Emperor Meiji, one of the most pivotal figures in Japanese history. Meiji had overseen the radical modernization of Japan, turning it from an isolated feudal society into an industrialized world power. After such a dynamic and revolutionary ruler, expectations for Yoshihito were high. But from the start, Taisho's life was marked by illness. He suffered from chronic meningitis as a child, which left him with lasting neurological issues. His health was fragile, his behavior sometimes erratic, and he struggled with cognitive and physical impairments throughout his life. Though he was crowned emperor in 1912, his condition prevented him from playing an active role in governance. And yet, paradoxically, Japan was undergoing rapid political and social change during his reign. The Taisho era saw a flourishing of democracy, art, and culture. Political parties gained more power, the Diet grew more influential, and urban culture began to shift toward modernism. Historians even called this period Taisho democracy, but the emperor himself had almost nothing to do with it. Taisho rarely appeared in public, unlike his father, who had traveled widely and projected an image of strength. Yoshihito preferred seclusion. When he did attend official ceremonies, his awkward mannerisms and occasional inability to deliver speeches made people uncomfortable. One famous incident occurred in 1913 during the opening of the imperial diatatio. In a moment of confusion, rolled up the speech he was supposed to read and peered at the politicians through it like a telescope. The newspapers quietly avoided reporting the embarrassing scene. As his health deteriorated further in the 1920s, Taisho effectively withdrew from public life entirely. His son, the future Emperor Shua, began taking on more and more of the ceremonial and political duties. By 1921, Taisho was formally declared incapable of ruling, and Hirohito was appointed regent. For the last 5 years of his life, Taisho lived in near total seclusion at the Hayama Imperial Villa, rarely seen by anyone outside the court. When he died in 1926, the nation mourned, but in truth, Hai's passing felt more like the quiet end of an era defined by others. His reign is remembered more for the changes happening around him, Japan's brief flirtation with liberal democracy, its participation in World War I on the side of the Allies, and the cultural boom of the 1910s and 20s then for anything he personally did. Taisho wasn't a tyrant or a hero. He was simply a gentle, sickly man born into a role he couldn't fully inhabit. Like Goma Mozono, his life shows how even the most exalted positions can sometimes trap people in quiet insignificance. The throne he inherited was powerful, but the man who sat upon it left almost no imprint on history. His era bears his name, yet he remains the faintest figure within it. Leopold II of Belgium, the king who hid behind a boring mask. At first glance, Leopold II of Belgium might seem like one of the dullest monarchs in European history. He wasn't a brilliant general like Napoleon, nor a dramatic romantic like Ludwig II of Bavaria. He wasn't overthrown in a blaze of revolution, nor remembered for grand speeches or stirring reforms. He seemed quiet, reserved, almost colorless, his long beard and stooped posture giving him the air of a somber bureaucrat rather than a king. But that bland exterior hid one of the most chilling contradictions in royal history. Leopold II appeared boring, but behind the polite facade lurked one of the most ruthless imperialists of the 19th century, a man whose obsession with power and wealth led to one of the greatest atrocities of the colonial era. Leopold was born in 1835, the second king of the newly formed Belgian state. Belgium, sandwiched between European giants like France and Germany, was a small, neutral country without an empire, but Leopold had bigger ambitions. He believed Belgium could become a great colonial power if only it could secure overseas territories like Britain, France, and the Netherlands had. When he ascended the throne in 1865, he cultivated an image of a modern, forward-thinking monarch. He spoke of progress, commerce, and humanitarianism. In public speeches, he expressed interest in civilizing Africa and bringing education and Christianity to its people. To the Belgian parliament, he seemed merely an eccentric king with grand but harmless dreams. But Leopold was far from harmless. He quietly funded a series of exploratory missions into Central Africa, using the famous explorer Henry Morton Stanley to map out vast regions of the Congo River basin. Leopold then pulled off one of the greatest diplomatic deceptions of the 19th century. At the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, where European powers carved up Africa, he convinced the world that he was establishing a humanitarian free state in the Congo, open to trade, free of slavery, and devoted to the welfare of the local population. In reality, the Congo Free State was not owned by Belgium. It was Leopold's personal colony, a private fiefdom. He didn't just rule it, he owned it like an estate. And what he did there remains one of history's darkest chapters. The Congo Free State became a vast forced labor camp. Villages were ordered to meet rubber and ivory quotas. If they failed, soldiers of the force public Leopold's private army burned their homes, took hostages, and mutilated men, women, and children. Hands were chopped off as proof that bullets hadn't been wasted. Whole communities were starved, enslaved, and exterminated. By the time the horrors ended, millions of Congolese, some estimates say up to 10 million people, had died from violence, starvation, and disease. And yet, back in Europe, Leopold maintained his image as a mild, dignified monarch. In Belgium, he built monuments, funded public works, and promoted himself as a great philanthropist. He even donated some of his ill-gotten fortune to parks, museums, and public buildings in Brussels, creating the illusion of a benevolent ruler. For years, the truth about the Congo was hidden behind this mask of dull respectability. European newspapers printed flattering stories about Leopold's civilizing mission, and even the Belgian people were kept in the dark. It wasn't until whistleblowers like British diplomat Roger Casement and activists like Edie Morel exposed the atrocities that the world began to see the king's true face. Under mounting international pressure, Leopold was finally forced in 1908 to relinquish the Congo Free State, transferring control to the Belgian government. But by then, the damage had been done. Leopold himself faced no trial, no punishment. He died the following year, in 1909. Despised by many, but still officially honored as Belgium's sovereign. Leopold II represents a unique kind of boring king. Outwardly, he seemed unremarkable, no fiery speeches, no dramatic battles, no revolutionary policies. But that ordinariness was a mask that allowed him to commit extraordinary cruelty without drawing immediate suspicion. He weaponized his dull image, using it to hide one of the most horrific exploitations in colonial history. He may not have been flamboyant like other tyrants, but his quiet, calculated evil left scars across an entire continent. And that's a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous kings aren't the loud, obvious ones. They're the ones who look boring.